Point C is great grace. Great restraint, great humility, and great grace. Verse 7, to keep me from being conceited because of these surpassingly great revelations, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. What was the thorn? What was the thorn? A thorn in my flesh. It's a word meaning something sharp. It was used of a tense stake or a big splinter, a sharp, irritating object. You know how terribly disconcerting it can be if you get one splinter in the finger, but your whole body can't rest until you get rid of it. It was sharp, it was irritating. It doesn't necessarily mean in his physical body, because the expression's used in the Old Testament in the book of Numbers about the pagan nations in Canaan incidentally, for those in TLF. And those nations that would become a thorn in your flesh. They would become a tremendous trial for you. Well, the options have been put forward. Here's the list if you want to jot a few down. He had malaria. He had an eye condition. He was guilty. He was depressed. He was depressed over failure to convert the Jews. It was Jewish persecution, perhaps, the thorn in the flesh. It was epilepsy. It was some ongoing sexual temptation. It was a speech defect. I rather like the option of the speech defect, because we've heard so much about it in this letter. Remember the charge? That his speech is deplorable, despicable. Paul even picks up on it himself and says, look, I'm not the least inferior to the super apostles. Next sentence, though I am inferior in speech, I'm not so in knowledge. Can you imagine Paul, if there was some speech defect or paralysis or something of one side of the mouth? Here he comes with this glorious gospel. An eloquent and articulate man who just can't get the words out. How terribly humiliating that must have been, if that was it. Don Carson sums up by saying, whatever it was very painful, extraordinarily embarrassing, and perhaps both. The thorn in the flesh. Now let's look at the significance of the thorn. I've got 4 headings here. Firstly, its severity. The thorn in the flesh, and 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away. Remember what you've heard about this bloke in chapter 11. What was it, 4 or 5 times he received the 39 lashes? Right, he's been beaten with rods. He's been stoned once. He's been shipwrecked 3 times. In danger from robbers and everything. All of these things, and there's no indication that he asked the Lord to remove them. He's no wimp. So whatever this thorn in the flesh was, it must have really tried him. He asked God to take this away, though he ran the apostolic race without complaint. It must have been terrible. Severity is the first thing. The second thing is timing. Timing. The language suggests pretty strongly that it was given to him after these great revelations, which probably rules out the birth defect bit. Verse 7, to keep me from becoming conceited. Because of these surpassingly great revelations, there was given me a thorn in my flesh. How much more humiliating. Not something that he could put down to his birth. Severity so far. Timing we've looked at. Purpose. To keep me from becoming conceited. This thorn in the flesh was given me. There was given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. But notice the divine passive. There was given me. Ultimately, it was God who allowed this to happen. Though Satan held the scalpel, it was the divine hand constraining his hand. There was given me the messenger of Satan to stop him from being conceited. Now, I find this pretty scary, because if the Apostle Paul needed something like this to keep him from being conceited, what on earth do I need? And what, my friends, do you need? If self-exaltation was such a danger for him, oh no, it must be a danger for us. Fourth thing is anonymity. Anonymity. We don't know exactly what it was. And that is a cause for rejoicing. And I think Paul has done this intentionally. That therefore all the Christian brothers and sisters who hear this letter are enabled to identify with him closely and personally, because the precise contours of the personal experience aren't there. It's a great blessing that he has left it unstated. What is the thorn in the flesh for you? Some people, I imagine, would have to think. Others, you've decided and you knew in your heart when you first heard this passage read. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Others of us, it may not be as immediately obvious. There are those here whose thorn in the flesh might be acne. You might have a lisp. You might have tried upfront things in your Christian group and really made what you perceive as a failure of it. Might be people here, perhaps the women who don't measure up to the beauty myth of our foolish world, and you feel that is a thorn in the flesh. It might be speech for you. It might be a lisp or some impediment. It could be some hidden depression which you don't dare talk about. No doubt there'll be some sexual difficulties or worries for some of us, if not all of us. What's the thorn in the flesh for you? What is the thing that you have asked the Lord to remove, not 3 times, 300 times? Notice what he says in verse 9. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Grace is gravitational. Grace pulls us down to earth by means of the thorn in the flesh. My grace is sufficient for you. Christ is using this thorn in the flesh to keep his beloved apostle and to keep him in his grace. And grace is proportional to weakness. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. If the weakness is this great, then the grace will be this great. If the weakness is this great, the grace will be this great. The grace will be sufficient for whatever the terrible impediment and this sharp thorn in the flesh that you or I have. Grace will be sufficient. God's kindness and benevolence in looking after us. The point of this passage is that God meets us, each of us, where we least want to be met. We want to be met at the point of human adequacy and gift and power and ability. But the God of the gospel is on about power in weakness. And the gospel touches most poignantly and compellingly not where we are adequate. You know that, and so do I. Great grace. Point D, great perseverance. Verse 11. He sums up, I've made a fool of myself, but you drove me to it. I ought to have been commended by you, for I am not in the least inferior to the super apostles, even though I'm nothing. The things that mark an apostle, signs, wonders and miracles, were done among you with great perseverance, which I suggested yesterday probably refers to the manner in which he performed them. Undemonstrative. What he's saying there, I think, is don't think that my ministry is all about apostolic signs and wonders, power and impressiveness. They were done. How were you inferior to the other churches, except that I was never a burden to you? Forgive me this wrong. Let me conclude with 2 points of application. The first is to stay awake to your world. Stay awake to your world and to stay close to Christ. There's a great book in the bookshop that we've put there. It's called Power Religion. It's a collection of essays by evangelical scholars. Some of the great and famous names, Jim Packer and Don Carson and others, are representative. And they discuss this theme and how we in the modern evangelical church have really sold out. Let me take two areas and illustrate. Of how we are going for power in power rather than power in weakness. Church growth, evangelism. I've mentioned the 7 habits of highly effective people. Think for a minute of what's going on in our churches. The user-friendly church, the user-friendly service, the seeker-sensitive service, so-called vital worship, as opposed, I imagine, to rather pale worship. Network of cell groups, this or that model of teaching, the Moore College model or another model. All these things, you see, by which if you push the right mechanistic button, it will happen for you, and the ministry of your church and your fellowship will suddenly become effective and powerful. I quote from one of the articles in that book on the subject of the church growth movement in the United States. One prominent church growth advocate was quoted in Christianity Today as acknowledging that somehow the principles just don't work. The same leader also pointed out that during the 1980s, the percentage of American adults attending church remained almost the same, about 45%, whereas Protestant church membership actually declined. We are only replacing the dead. The evangelical body is not growing. Churches are growing by the rearranging of the saints. Exciting and larger ones that have drum kits. Instead of church growth principles replacing evangelism, they've merely succeeded at undermining evangelism by placing success in the hands of technicians instead of the believing community as it bears witness to the gospel. This is one of the great messages of this letter. Stay awake to your world. If you're involved in ministry or you're looking for leaders in ministry, a leader mustn't come in the power of his or her gifts. It's true for me and it's true for everyone. The truly Christian minister must come in the power of a godly and humiliating and sacrificial lifestyle. One of the things I've learned from the Apostle Paul these last few months is to think of ministry differently. When you're looking for a minister at your church, I look for junior staff. One of the things which will now be at the top of my list is the capacity to suffer humbly for Christ. That should be right up there on the list, shouldn't it? Because if the Apostles' model doesn't fit well with us, we really have no business in Christian ministry. We don't need commanding personalities. We need commandeered personalities. Commandeered people. I've spoken about church growth and evangelism. Now to talk about personal growth and edification. Personal growth. We were talking to 2 supporters of the AFES in Brisbane. A bloke and his wife, who was a doctor, a GP. And she was complaining about the unhealthy denial of weakness there is in our churches. She says how she sees so many Christian patients who come in who are struggling with all sorts of terrible difficulties, of depression and anxiety and sexual problems and God does indeed know what. All these terrible things. And she says, what on earth are the churches teaching our people? Why do they have this model of the perfectly adjusted, well-to-do, got-it-all-together Christian life? And Christian friends are under a terrible burden because they're not like that. We can have an unhealthy denial of our weakness or an obsession with it. Do you know where I'm going to be on Monday morning? I'm going to be seeing a counsellor on Monday morning. I wonder what you think of me, having heard me this week. I'm going to see somebody who is helping me to straighten out the way I think and feel about life. My father died 21 years ago, and last year, through some really upsetting experiences, it became clear to me that I had unfinished business. and that deep down in my hollow chest is a little boy who misses his dad. You might perceive me as a strong leader. You are wrong. People tell me I am, but apart from a gracious work of God, I don't think I will ever feel that. My perception of the Christian life for 17 years has been of battling against the wind in choppy seas. It has been of trying to keep together what is falling apart. It has been of this trench warfare between the intellectual and the emotional components of Keith. That's where I will be, the conference speaker. And I confess to being torn. I'm torn because I'm seeing a counsellor to try and put things together again, and yet I'm scared about putting things together again because I don't want them put together too much. Because I have one close Christian friend who's been put together and who's now more self-adjusted, but is in fact less godly, who is more able as a human being, whose thorn in the flesh is far less sharp, but who is further from Christ, not closer. Please pray for me. I want to be together, but I prefer to be with Christ. How would Paul react if he walked with us down the aisles of the Christian bookstores? How would he react as he saw the hundreds of titles on Christian togetherness, where now it is a common Christian language of the dysfunctional family and of self-esteem and all these categories of human speaking and analysis, and we speak as though this was the language that the apostles and prophets were grasping to realise. But it's not. They spoke about Christ and atoning death and faith and thorns in the flesh. I try to remind myself that if everybody in this room was perfectly adjusted and everybody in this room was perfectly reconciled to themselves and to the person beside them, if we were all humanly speaking perfect, it would still take the death of God's only Son for us to be reconciled to Him. Self-realisation is not salvation. Don't spurn the thorn in the flesh that God has given you. If it keeps you relying on the grace of Christ, it is a wonderful gift. Don't despise the limp that God has given you. Stay close to Christ. I conclude with a story. We saw this video on holidays with our children. It was called Homeward Bound, and it's the film made of a book called The Incredible Journey. It's a book about three pets. A story of three pets. It's written for children, but it's really an adult story. The first of the pets is an old dog called Shadow. He's a venerable old dog, a Labrador, I think. And there's a bulldog pet, a young fellow, called Chance. And there is a Persian cat called Sassy. And these three pets each have a voice in the movie. And the family that owns them, the three children and their mum and dad, they move away to San Francisco, and these three pets are taken from the Midwest and taken to a ranch. Anyway, the family's going to be there for about 3 months. But the old dog, Shadow, who is the responsible Pauline figure of the story, he decides that they must go home, that something's wrong. And so they jump over the fence and off they go to cross the Rocky Mountains. They encounter numerous terrible hardships. They fight a bear and the cubs. They're attacked by a mountain lion. They almost freeze to death. The family has long since given up hope. The 3 little children are broken-hearted. About 5 months later, the family moves back to their home. The final scene of the movie is one afternoon around sunset, and the family is sitting out on the grass, and they hear a barking. And one of the little boys, he looks up, and sure enough, there is Chance, the bulldog pup, running over the hill. And Chance come running down, and of course the music strikes up, and Marion and I were blubbering by this point. And the little boy runs up, and there's his doggy. And the doggy has his voice, a human voice. "Hey, Johnny!" And there's a big hug, and they go in. And then they hear meow, meow. And over the hill comes this little feline personality. It's Sally Field's voice. And she comes down, she's quite put out because her fur is dirty. And of course the little girl snuggles up this cat. It's a wonderful moment. But there's no Shadow. There's no elder dog. He's apparently gone. And his little master, Peter, is terribly saddened. They turn to go inside. And there over the hillside comes Shadow, limping. He's broken his leg. He's managed to get these 2 younger pets home over the Rockies. He's almost dead. He comes down the hill, and the little boy runs up and hugs him. But as he does, Shadow's voice says, "Peter, I've been so worried about you." Shadow is the Apostle Paul. "Corinthians, I've been so worried about you." He has busted his guts. He has followed in the Master's footsteps. And he invites us to do the same. Not only can you and I finish the incredible journey of ministry, the amazing thing is we can do so while keeping our eyes on someone else. That is superabundance of mercy. Not only can you finish the road, but you can do so while thinking of others. What's the Christian life about? It's about comfort in affliction. It's about glory in shame. It's about wealth in poverty, losing yourself in others and thus finding yourself. It's about power in love of Christ and his apostle. And preeminently it's about power and weakness. Let's pray. Dear Father in heaven, have mercy on us now. Enable us to take these things to heart. Continue your good work in us. Help each of us here and our friends from overseas and from other states to finish the incredible journey, to run the race. Do continue your work in us. Work in our weakness according to your power. And grant us sufficient grace for the trials that are so lovingly given. In Jesus' name, amen.